So this is Thomas. I'm here with Sanduni and Michelle from OG Rose. And yeah, we've had a conversation, or attempted a conversation for a couple of months now, about the nature of relationships. And I was compelled by a conversation these two had with Javier, and I thought it was a very compelling conversation about relationships and the nature of it. And it inspired me to write an essay series, a little essay piece on figures of trauma. So these are the dynamics of how interpersonal relationships work between people, especially when there's trauma patterns inside individuals, almost figures that are obscuring or kind of get in the way of what a relationship is supposed to be about. And that eventually, I guess, inspires Sanduni and Michelle to want to reach out to me to have a conversation. So thank you all for your time. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, no, thank you, Thomas. Thank you. I really did appreciate that essay very much, and I hope people go and read it. They can find it on your Medium page. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Excellent. Excellent. So yeah, I think that some of the questions that Sanduni brought up regarding that was specifically about self and how do we see self in relation to other. How do we and some questions of also like oneness and sameness, like how is it that we are in a relationship and maintain our self, but also learn to have this very unique new almost life with another person, and what exactly happens in that dynamic, because it's very easy to just have either one self over the other dominate, or so one self can feel like less. It almost can even be, I mean, in like really bad relationships, it can be completely suffocated, really. And so that's I think there's an interesting thing happening in relationships where there can be sort of a power dynamic, and it probably is from that trauma, Thomas, that you mentioned, because if that trauma has not really been identified, then it's almost like you have this visceral, almost like corporal desire to still resolve that trauma. And it's very easy to just use another person to make you not have to look into yourself, right? Like you just kind of can project onto that other person. And I do wonder, and maybe it could just be a question, like I do think trauma often is what causes the toxic relationships and the challenges where there are these, this power dynamic, or the sense of one person's more dominant and one person is less, and therefore then somebody feels like they're like losing themselves in that relationship. I mean, I think like the idea of really working out one's trauma, I don't know. I mean, it's probably like an ongoing process, but at least if you try, right? I feel like there's going to be at least a better sense of, well, okay, who am I exactly? What do I value? Like, what are the things I value? And how could I not just use another person to fix something that I alone can really fix? No one else can really fix for me. So I think that something that does come to mind though with the things I've just brought up is Daniel actually wrote a short piece on singularity and harmony. And it's really important to get this concept right, because if not, we do start to feel like, even if we say we don't, we still end up wanting the person to be like us, because it's easier that way. Like if they were like us, they could know what we were thinking, they could know our desires, they could know our hurts without even having to explain ourselves or express ourselves. And in having to explain and express, there's always the fear of like miscommunication or not being understood. And that's difficult because we just want to be understood. Almost, I'm like, it's always an interesting thing. Like, do we want to, it's almost like we can't really feel loved if we're not understood. So anyways, the paper, the singularity and harmony, I think what we really have to try to strive towards is the harmony, where like you have distinct instruments, but they harmonize. They don't have dissonance with each other, but they don't take over each other. They don't become each other, because if you become each other, then it's like you will just be a singularity, which I guess is fine, but you end up losing both. Like you lose both the violin and the trumpet, like completely. So those are a couple of thoughts that come to mind, but I do think there is, now you could get into like, how does one practically do that? But I do think that the goal does in the goal being harmony versus singularity, or what I want to say is like the goal being able to, work in tandem with one another versus like take over is an important thing. And I think one of the things that could help not have it be this constant power dynamic.
I think that's quite true. I mean, Michelle, you made a lot of points about trauma, and obviously our topic is sameness and oneness. Now, really, in most relationships, you think you found a sense of familiarity, but that could also be known as trauma bonding. You try, I mean, misery finds company, that's what they say, right? And usually you sort of tend to find comfort in knowing you've got the same toxic traits or the same problems that you share in common. And that leads to a development of some sort of relationship without you fixing your shortcomings. And when you talked about the instruments, I think the only difference between us and instruments are that we don't seek validation in our uniqueness. As much as our differences are acknowledged, we want to be validated. Whether it's a relationship or a friendship or family, you want your individuality, if you think you do have one, to be acknowledged. And I think that has a profound effect on how it shapes your relationship with an individual, because you talk about sameness and oneness, but are you aware of who you really are? Yes, we seek to be understood by the other person, but do you understand yourself? Do you know what you're sort of bringing to the table, or do you know that you don't know whether you understand or don't understand yourself? These are questions that you really have to consider in a relationship, and I think that comes with a certain sense of self-awareness. Are you mindful of your actions? Are you really present? Are you thinking, or are you listening? And yes, most relationships are about listening to the other person, right? But do you listen to yourself in the middle of all of this? Somehow the sense of self is lost because you're so fixated in trying to comprehend the individual that you're trying to get to know and mold your way around their life, that you forget that, there's like two sides to the coin to make a full coin, and you've got to acknowledge both those sides. And I think that's where the sense of self and sameness comes into play. It's a very thin line. Yes, there are chances where you could more or less be a similar individual, but how aware are you of yourself to begin with when you go into something else to say, I am X, Y, and Z? Because we're constantly evolving as human beings. So do we really ever know ourselves? What we are today is not what we are tomorrow. And I think those are some interesting elements that you have to discuss and think about when pursuing whatever sort of relationship that you are pursuing. And those are my thoughts on it.
I think the first thing, and kind of like the essay itself, by the way, what motivated me to write the essay was, at the time I was going through art therapy at the time. And it's funny because I think for the longest time I was so against it, against therapy in general. I still hold some of those positions still. I think especially when it becomes a personality trait and it becomes the way in which you identify, kind of what Sanduni just said, where misery loves company, just like, and I remember Aristotle talking about this, relationships based on vices are completely unstable because they change based on the context and the time and are not reliable. So I still hold to that issue. If people attach them, if their wounds are what they attach to, and that's what they identify themselves as. But this whole point of projection is that the biggest problem is, quite frankly, you're literally something false in front of you. You don't see the person, you're seeing the trauma. This is actually very subtly what when the classical tradition talks about vice or viciousness of a disconnect from truth, it's because you're not seeing reality. You are not able to perceive what's actually in front of you because something obscuring. There's a lot of biblical or religious connotations of sin being a veil, kind of coming in the same way, that these things get in the way that block you from actually seeing what's in front of you. So that's why I like projection, because it's like it's a schema kind of just projected onto this relationship, and especially when it's on this kind of validation run. This is also why, Michelle, your conversation, I remember from the last video series with Javier and Sanduni about the roller coaster, right, as an person in the mountains, a very great apt metaphor, right? Because in a roller coaster, you end up exactly back where you started, right? Versus a mountain has a mode of increase of transcendence or developments in some way. And that's kind of what generally happens in validation games, right? Basically, there's a kind of one member basically needs to subsume himself in the other, and it just basically there's almost no guarantee that anything good will come out of that. So I just had that image in my mind hearing this right now.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing about, like, you know, the origins of your essay and like what you were doing at the time. Did you find art therapy to be helpful for you, Thomas?
Oh, immensely.
Really?
Yeah, and I think there were specific conditions why that was, to be honest. But in general, yeah, I think it was a very powerful modality for me.
Yeah, I think that's interesting, like, because you mentioned in the essay about trauma, how it's almost like stored within. I would only imagine that, like, having a place to actually just draw out, like the act of art, right, and any expression in general, is to really take something inside and let it out, kind of like let it, almost to put it down, you know. It's like, it's okay, you can put this down now, because we carry things so much that often we don't need to, but we believe we must for some reason. So I'm glad that art therapy was helpful. And it made me think, like, with the word vice and vicious, and it's interesting how, like, that almost, I mean, I think etymology is pretty interesting. So it would be interesting to see, like, any links with, like, vision itself, you know, but also virtue is another, like, that just to think about, like, where these words kind of have their holding places. But I think about, like, you know, a lot of times vice, you know, it makes me think of the word, like the image vice grip, right? Like, you're really gripped to that, like you're really locked into that. And it, you know, it makes me think of the roller coaster analogy, right? Because, like, you're strapped in, like, this is, you know, you're really strapped in, and you're not going to be able to go anywhere. But I think, like, if that's the only thing we've ever really known, then you're like, yep, start up the ride. Like, I'm, you know, this is what I'm here for. And we might not realize that there are other types of relationships. There are other types of journeys and rides, per se, that actually give you headway, like that do actually give real, you know, like, also physically, if you're sitting in a roller coaster, you're really not using your body, like, you're not actually gaining any muscle strength or anything like that. Whereas, like, a mountain, well, if you're hiking mountains, like, you will probably sweat, you will probably, you know, get stronger to some capacity. So I think it's interesting, though, because trauma does something where it still physically damages, but there's no regrowth, you know. It's just like, it just keeps somebody in a vice grip of damage but no repair. Whereas, like, if you're climbing a mountain or something, yeah, you're, like, damaging your muscles, but you're getting stronger, and you've also, like, moved through space and time, you know, to like see another vantage point. You're also able to be free to go where you want to go on that mountain, versus, you know, the analogy of the roller coaster, you're not free to go where you want to go. And I think that's often what I do think that I appreciate, like, talking about that analogy again here in the light of your essay, and in the light of talking about trauma, vice, virtue, because I think there is something that can really resonate for anyone who's been in, like, a toxic relationship, where there is that immobility, like, you just feel very very stuck in that, and yet you don't maybe know that that's, you know, that there's actually an option to get out and to go and to really be able to be free from that. But I don't know, maybe it has to take, like, a self-assertion or something, like, you know, realizing that you can. And I think that's why with art therapy, and in general, like, the good version of therapy, not where, like, we identify with our, you know, victimhood or something like that, but we actually see the empowerment of, like, I can pick up this pen and I can lift. I mean, just that simple act, just to kind of get the ball rolling, to say, like, you can do something, you know. And sometimes just, like, being reminded about that is so powerful. You know, you can do something, you can let it go, you can move beyond it, you can use what abused you to be somebody stronger and better, you know. So anyways, it kind of makes me think about like how, you know, vices are kind of thought of as just like, you know, bad things people do that they shouldn't do, which is true. But at the same time, it's often because of this like profound hurt and like lack that's like, it's like they're so hungry, they'll eat poison, basically.
I think life is merely an act of becoming, unbecoming, and accepting. It really is those three things for me, if I had to summarize it. And I feel like with trauma, usually we fixate on the suffering of trauma. We never sit down and think to ourselves, yes, it is hurting, but what is it trying to teach you? I think that's the important question you have to ask yourself when you're trying to heal from trauma, because or else you try and end up projecting it to someone else or onto another person or a situation. You end up carrying it with you instead of learning from it. And the mountain analogy can have two perspectives. Sometimes it's not about climbing the mountain. Sometimes it's coming all the way back down because you don't have the same persistence. You fixate on going up because that's the hard thing. Yes, that is important, but sometimes coming down from all that you've accomplished or you've become and learned, and to finally unbecome, to become someone better, is somehow simple, but even more difficult. Because nobody talks about the journey back, right? You somehow want to get to the top. You're like, that's the hard part. That really isn't, because you have that determination. It's when you've got to look back and reflect on your journey that you struggle, or you hinder yourself from doing it because you think, oh, that's not really the important part, right? Being on top is the important part. Finishing the journey is. And in a lot of these relationships, I feel you really have to reevaluate and reflect on your actions. That's why when you're pursuing someone, you put your entire effort into that. But in order to sustain or maintain that stability, that's when you start lacking effort or energy or the motivation to do. And that leads to a lot of different outcomes, sometimes into the complete downfall of a relationship. So when you talk about oneness and sameness and the implications it has on a relationship and how you deal with trauma, you have to realize that trauma isn't something you're supposed to project, right? It's supposed to be something you accept. Like, you have to acknowledge your own red flags before you acknowledge someone else's. Yes, if you've experienced it, you know what it is. But then if you don't do anything about it, you're just going to find it elsewhere, you know, in a different body. That'll change. The person changes, but your experience remains and the pattern prevails. So you have to change the pattern. That's where the secret is. And that involves so much of unbecoming, because we grow up with so much influence, whether it's education, our way of life, our families, the kind of relationship our parents have with each other. All of these set our expectations when we go into a relationship, whether you're young or in your 30s or even a little later. Somehow you carry your childhood memories, and a lot of trauma is infused during your childhood. I mean, that's what many therapy sessions have revealed, that you've picked up these traits at a very young age and somehow you accepted that to be okay or normal. So in order to prevail or, you know, overcome the situation, you really have to understand and ask yourself, what is this experience trying to teach me, and have I learned from it? We focus so much on healing that we don't focus on what we're supposed to learn from that experience. At least that's how I see it. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think the idea of healing is a kind of understanding, because the basic the pretense, I mean, the biggest kind of reveal I think a good therapy is supposed to do is, that's why I really appreciate, Michelle, your comments on having a space to let go, to hold space, to basically take what's unspeakable and make it spoken. And that's why I like the art of therapy actually was very powerful, because it moved from abstraction into concreteness, in particulars that were made, and allowed me to kind of cognize on these things that were unspoken. And fundamentally, I think the thing for me personally about it was, I like the idea of poison, kind of eating poison, because the idea here was that it was things acting upon me that I wasn't even aware. So it's a kind of emotional bias that was not allowing me to see what's actually in front of me. So therefore, actually, the relationships, in a way, are not me loving the beloved of the actual person in front of me. It's this pattern instead that's in my head. So it's actually, you're radically alone. And it's actually very devastating when you kind of realize that. And kind of the whole point is, eventually, of course, I mean, anyone who goes into therapy is going to be told, or going to find out that, yes, you did these, the traumas are not there by accident. They're survival patterns. They're there because you had to survive. And this was how you coped. And that worked great under one context, but 90% of the time, you're not there. That's the reason why it's actually a kind of falsehood. So that's almost like if you have a commitment to, that's actually where, you know, I think it's very important to go into therapy. I agree. The healing is the understanding. And the understanding is what? That you have a commitment to the truth, that you're going to hold yourself accountable to the truth. And that is that I was living in falsehood. That's ultimately what it comes down to. And a lot of people want to keep their falsehoods, ultimately. I think that maybe I'm a little unfair in that judgment, but I do feel that the radical responsibility required to hold yourself accountable for that is wrenching. It is, because then you realize that the shortcomings in your life, it's very easy to blame someone else or blame circumstance, but to say you're responsible for it and you have a responsibility to it, it's a very different perspective. And I think the idea of exactly like the fixation is not just on I suffered or I was wronged or something happened to me. It's part of the conversation. You have to understand that has to be acknowledged, but it's not just that. It's more. It's like what of it? How does this help you? How do you move this forward? What do you exactly fix? Like what is the aim? Because that's actually the really big thing. I think ultimately the kind of the key distinctions about virtue and vice is the object of desire, right? The thing that is focused on, where your attention is on. And I think ultimately, I mean, also even in nature, what love is, right? Charity and love is willing the good of the other. So it's all, and that's the thing. It's like, actually, that's why Sanduni, your comment about the mountain going down, meaning like I overcame these challenges. I have to now give it up, the kind of act of sacrifice in giving. I mean, is that not, I mean, fundamentally, and I think, you know, kind of taking these abstractions going now into relationships in general. I mean, I have to say a lot of them, and that's actually as you get older, you know, it gets harder to actually have relationships, I would argue. One is because most people hold on to the pain that traumas they got, and they're not willing to let go, and they don't want to be hurt. And then top it off, it's almost they basically start not trusting other people because they don't trust themselves. Mm-hmm. So it's almost guaranteed that you don't, once you don't have the naivety of youth anymore, then it takes a higher challenge to actually willing to be intimate with another and not just this figure, this abstraction in your mind. In a lot of, it's a very different beast of a conversation. And it takes a lot of challenge. It's a very difficult thing. I don't think it's very common, and I think it's a very big challenge. That's why when I do see examples of relationships where that has been overcame and shown and what a relationship could actually be, this kind of mode of giving and wishing the goodness of someone else, that may even mean sacrificing yourself. Ideally, no. No one would naturally want to do that normally in normal circumstances. But the push came to shove, it became wishing the good of another is something that's in your attention, is something a very key indicator versus your own self-interest of utility or pleasure or something like that.
And ultimately, right, like to wish the goodwill, to wish goodness for another, like the ideal situation, it's very strange because it's almost like the moment, and this kind of relates to your essay too, Thomas, where you talk about the selfful, right, instead of selfless or selfish. It's like the ideal situation is that it's actually not the focus. If like, am I getting the good or are they getting the? It's almost like it's a reciprocal thing, right, in a relationship. If both people want the goodwill of the other or for the other, then actually you end up both people get the goodwill, both people get the goodness, and I think that's what it should ultimately be. It's just like you said, it's just so darn hard in reality with real people. But when you wish the best for that other person, that also means to sometimes like let them go sometimes too. Like if we're talking about like, you know, sometimes like wanting, it's it's, I think also what makes this tricky, and I hope I can word this right, what makes it tricky too is that it's hard for that not to become like a savior complex, right? Where it's like, okay, you want to wish that you want the goodwill for that person. But then it can become how you define good for that person, right? Because most people think that they're doing good for the other person, or that they want the best for the other person. And there can be a savior mentality of like, well, I will make sure that happens for them, and this is what that means. And it's so I guess like it's coming back to like this word that I jotted down in notes while listening, where there's this radical irony, because there has to be a freedom in a successful relationship, like the freedom kind of in the Rilke sense, right, where we protect one another's solitude, where he talks about that, where we kind of have this like deep almost reverence for the other person's self that we are not, and we will never be, even if we're like, you know, one flesh married, very, very close daily contact with a person, they still are their own person, and they have a self that is, that, you know, you protect, you want to like live in a way that does protect that solitude for them, in the sense of not them being alone. I'm not talking about that sense of the word solitude, but in the sense of them being able to connect with their own self and be able to hear what their own self is saying, just so that actually they be like, if you have that good that relationship with self, where you're able to deal and put down your traumas and grapple through that, which is going to be like a lifetime process, but you know, you can take the time to do that and to work through it and to write things out and to paint things out and to, you know, learn from others experiences. But then if you have that, then it does help for the relationship itself. You know, the relationship is really not going to be able to be as strong as it could be if each person is not allowed to have that solitude, in the sense of, you know, being able to know that there's kind of a self that is always going to be that person's, you know, mind and heart and what they're working with, and kind of like enabling, like allowing the person to be able to work through that is important, because they can only do that work. You cannot do it for them, because and then if you try to do it for them, you often will also prescribe what that should look like, what it should look like for them to work through it. And I've just seen that be pretty disastrous. So it's a very interesting thing, because it probably does boil down a lot to Thomas, to what you said on truth, right? Like, we only really understand good if we have truth. You know, beauty, truth, and goodness have to kind of always be in this, you know, this kind of Trinitarian dance, if you will. And I think if to understand what it means to have the goodwill for the other, you have to really kind of still your mind and your racing thoughts, emotions that are often high in relationships, and you know, really kind of get in touch with like, what are the truth of things as well, and what ultimately, like when truth and goodness are, you know, try to move towards it, like that's going to end up being something beautiful anyways, you know, whether that relationship is, you know, maintained. I guess I'm just trying to think about like that counterpoint where somebody's like, well, what if it's a toxic relationship? If you want the goodwill for the other person, couldn't you just stay in it, because you're kind of like, you're being the sustenance for that other person, right, who maybe is very like needy, or has these like hurts, but they're like filling it in with another person. But it's almost like sometimes, you know, good can look like not good sometimes, you know. And so that it just kind of adds to the complexity. Like, we're talking about insanely hard things, human relations, and then we also add the complexity of good, and it just must be informed by truth, you know. And thinking about like what is the ultimate good for the person, not just like what is going to be good for them right now, because it's not always like, if you have a bigger scope of things, then it is easier to see like, okay, what might be actually better in the long run versus what I'm just saying would be good right now. And often, like, people will say they want the good for the other person, but they really just want them to do what they want them to do. So it gets kind of tricky. But yes, I think that ultimately, like, to wish the good for the other, and to I mean, if I think about this in like marriage, it's like you live, both people live in a way for one another. So then they end up still getting something very incredible, because both lives have been kind of given over to each other, if that makes any sense. So it's a very, I guess my main point was just like, it's a very reciprocal thing. But then we get into the nuances of like, what does it mean to wish the goodwill for the other, which is going to really require the truth the truth of the matter, and you know what's, and also, like I said, the freedom, right? This kind of letting the person come to terms with what is good, what is good for them, what is going to be good for them to actually heal and be able to work through their hurts or pains that they're holding on to and really need to let go. So a myriad of thoughts that came up there from that.
I think you both make some brilliant points, and we're really onto something. I mean, let's start with what Thomas said about self and about being self-full and selfless. I think what we forget to acknowledge or address in a beginning of a relationship or in a relationship is that we pursue someone or someone pursues us because they see something they gain from us or they like from us. That's the first instinct. You don't really like an individual because they like you. You like them because you like something about them or a quality that they have, or some sort of motivation is there over there. And then we talk about wanting the good for another person. And I think that's a very striking point, because that's where you tend to end up becoming the empath or the narcissist. Do you want to be the source of happiness or goodness to that person? So you end up being the empath. And if you're the only one receiving it, you become the narcissist, because you have this unrealistic expectation that the other individual's entire life revolves around making you happy. And that's where the scales are not balanced. And that's where a lot of trauma bonding happens, and a lot of trauma is infused, because you lose yourself and your importance and what you want from the other individual, because you know that you are the source of their happiness, or you're the only one that can bring any sort of goodness. And frankly, that to me is positive toxicity, because do we ever really know what's good for another individual? We can't completely decide that. And I think you make that point very well, Michelle, because sometimes you do more harm than good when you try to do something overly good for the other individual, because you're here assuming that's what they want, or that's what they should be wanting, because they're so narcissistic that they don't know what they want. And that's where you sort of blur the lines and become very toxic, and it ends up becoming full of hatred, because you feel you went out of your way to be there for this individual or to make them happy, and they just can't seem to appreciate it. But it is true, they never asked for it. They just kept receiving it. But are they aware they kept receiving it, or, you know, seeking it out from you? And I feel like in relationships, when two individuals come together, it's so important to realize that we have different needs. We do, we completely do. We have a mutual common ground, but I am my own individual first. I think for myself, I have my own priorities. And if you don't, you should, right? That's how it should be. You need to appreciate your own solitude and your own character before you share that space with someone else. A relationship is not supposed to be something that makes you one in mind. It's supposed to make you one in your companionship, in how much you offer. It has to be the same scales. I mean, sometimes, yes, it's slightly different, but you can't really expect the oneness of mind, because where's the fun in that if you're just a clone of the other individual? You know, one person talks and the other person agrees, and that's going to make a very dull, mundane life. That's not what we want. But it often tends to happen because someone ends up becoming the empath. You know, you try and become the bigger person in a relationship because you have a higher tolerance, or you think that's the way to go. Because in a lot of relationships, if you think you know better, you try and vocalize it to them in a way where you don't hurt their feelings, and you end up getting hurt yourself. And that indirectly makes you a bitter person in the end, because when you come out of it, you just explode. You're a ticking time bomb. And that trauma goes on to the next person you meet. It's a cycle. It really is a cycle. You break free from one, but you indirectly trap someone else in the same cycle. Think about it. I mean, I've sort of read about this and I've experienced it myself, and a lot of reflecting has been done, and I've seen that in the journey of being the empath, you forget to empathize because you don't see that happening for you, and somehow that feeling or that sensation is lost in the process of trying to do good to another individual. And by no means do I mean not to do it. I think it's very important that, you know, you have a sense of selflessness and you try and put another person's needs first, and that's love. and that's needed. But you've got to draw the line where you know this person is meeting you halfway, or else it's just you being lonely in a two-person relationship because nobody acknowledges what you're doing. And that makes you lose yourself, because after a long time, you believe that this isn't working, this isn't real, I'm doing it wrong, is what you think. And that becomes your reality. So those are my thoughts on, doing good and projecting it and how it's perceived or received by the other individual and how it changes the course of the relationship for better or worse. What do we think?
I'm kind of, the kind of core part of the essay was the self-full, right? Kind of this kind of slamming of words, kind of in the context of, beautiful, right? Something like that, where it's something full of some property. So in this case, it's, self. So, because the biggest thing is, and kind of, I also have a note about this personally, because I heard this note about beauty. There's a difference between things that we want to possess versus witness, right? Something that we desire. There's this kind of this empath narcissist dichotomy. It's a possession quality, right? This is where this kind of privation kind of mode. I'm using that term purposely because it has a very specific meaning in this case. These motions and movements are on possession, right? Possessing the other, possessing the mind, possessing attention or affection or things like that, versus witness. Because possession's idea, like you desire something, you're needing something that's not you're without, versus witnessing. There's a kind of, if you're gonna use a Kantian mode, you can say it's a kind of dispassionate kind of contemplation. I don't necessarily think I don't think that's true. I'm not really agreeing with that, but I think it's more in the kind of more of a joy perspective. Like when you're in joy, you're not really there to seize the thing that you're witnessing. You are just contemplating it and just enjoying of being around it and having its presence. So for example, like seeing nature, like a beautiful sunset. You cannot possess the sunset. It's not really a desire to. It's more of a witness. You're just kind of in this awe of this beautiful moment. And it's always a singular thing, isn't it, by the way? Beauty always seems to be actually singular, unique, and of a one in that sense, which is kind of interesting that, this idea of like what we mean by one is not clear, because there's a kind of one of the individual sense, right? This kind of me and you, and this kind of not kind of just being crushed and subsumed. And that's actually its own trauma, by the way, when love figures, usually parents, by the way, usually this happens, either emotionally or sexually or some other dimension, basically subsume the child one way or the other. That completely destroys their internal principles of kind of autonomy of space, basically within themselves, which causes own problems in relationships later. Kind of an empathetic kind of tendency built in from that. But anyways, the other mode of good I'm hearing here is kind of when Michelle brought up with this idea of like, what is the relationship? There are only certain goods that are going to be possible. I wrote in the essay, there are only certain goods that are possible in communion with other people. They are not possible as individuals. They're only possible in communion with another. And this is true in law. This is true in economies. And I think relationships are a very fair point. There are only certain things possible. The most obvious one from a, cis relationship is obviously children. That's one direction, not necessarily the only way, but it's explicitly one way that comes out of it. But that's just the beginning. There's everything else built from that. And ideally, and by the way, I want to point out too, this idea of like caring for the other, like wishing the good of the other. We kind of normally, this is actually why I like the term self-full, because we normally think of it as self-sacrifice. You have to give yourself away, right? And you're losing something for the sake of someone else. Self-full is meant to point out, no. And actually, it's funny. I reread Aristotle's Ethics about this. The person who gives up something for another, who's actually getting something even superior than money or pleasure or anything like that, or utility, it's nobility. The high is good, the noble. So what you're actually a person of virtue who is self-full, who actually has everything they need, they actually, when they do those moments of sacrifice for another or giving to another or wishing good for the other, they're actually gaining something even more important, that it's prized and worthy of attention and worthy of pursuing. That's actually more almost like super abundance, basically, like the cup run of over kind of properties going on, because things that are noble generally still generate more. So Michelle hinted at it because she said when we made a comment about when you're in a common good, things come out that were not possible individually. So there's kind of abundance, something comes out of it. So through the interrelationship with each other, there's something greater that's possible that comes out of it. I think that's a really powerful point. And by the way, actually another big point about that, yeah, the big thing is one, just that idea of like, oh, I want to do good and I'm going to do the good for you because I think I know what's right for you. I mean, first of all, one, that's like completely dismissing any ability for them to make their own judgments, first of all. So it's actually incredibly condescending and incredibly saying, no, I'm superior to you because I know better for you. Well, excuse me, having you what? Now I think it's a critical moment. It's like, actually, I think this is where like common rational, like, I don't know, and usually this is rational principles. So we kind of get skewed what that means, like almost like as a rule, like an algorithm. That's not true. Well, what's the common, like, what are the things that you care about together? If there's a, for example, right, let's say your partner is into the arts, like really interested in making painting, for example. I'll just come up with something, encouraging them, championing them to produce art when they were hesitant about it. That's an example, but it's almost unreasonable to like force them to go take painting classes or to force them, like, it's a good intention, but that's not, no, you're kind of overstepping the bounds there. Just doesn't give it concreteness to that point about sometimes we can't presume the good of someone else. And even if you have a common understanding of what that other person wants and desires and wishes for, you have to there's a role you have to play as their friend, really. It's kind of no different than in friendships in that sense. You really can't, friendships are not supposed to do that. Like if my friend came to me and started like, I don't know, throwing me into an art gallery, I'm like, what are you doing? I didn't want this. I appreciate it, but this is not what I wanted. Thank you. Because I kind of think of it in that same way. Yeah. And also that's the thing, actually, that's the key thing is like also the difference between, goods that are ends and means, the big difference. Having a common understanding of what the common good is as a end is a very different conversation from the means. And part of actually kind of respect for one another is to say, we might have a common end. Well, we can have a diversity of means to achieve it. I think that's actually a very healthy way. And usually trauma patterns don't allow you to do that. You're like, nope, I need oneness. I need consist in that sameness mode. Not because that's the problem with it. It kind of wants to sandwich and remove all difference or distinction. It wants to just smash it all together to be the same. That's why we're one. No, that's what I mean by like that tension of what we mean by one. We're talking about this kind of like an unacceptability of difference of any kind of distinction or variety, right? Diversity in means, usually in the means, right? Versus a common one in the end of why we're together in the first place.
No, that like, where do I begin? I've taken all these notes with this purple highlighter that was available here. But no, I think that's so good what you said, and I think what's coming to mind a bit too is this interesting thing because I have an identical twin sister. We're very, very close. We're very, very similar. And so I think it's always interesting to me, like when I hear these discussions on like, difference and distinction and oneness, sameness, harmony, singularity. And I just think like, it's really interesting though, because there is, how do I put this? With being identical twins, we are two distinct human beings, but we were literally, as identical twins, technically, biologically, we were like one person, and then we became two people. So there's such a level of being in sync that it's almost like you can mind read. It's almost like you can, just know what you want, because like whatever I want, she wants. I'm hungry, she's hungry. Like, of course, like we're gonna go make a snack together. It's just, there's such an in-syncness there that is kind of wild, actually, to have had, just to have the privilege to experience that level of in sync is quite fascinating. And it does make me wonder, like, how I think there is a place for being able to almost like learn one another, right? To the place where you kind of you understand things about the other that are so particular to them, that are so, I want to say intimate, really, that there's something that is really amazing that people have an opportunity to find that with one another. But I think like perhaps with Mary-Lise and I, my twin sister and I, having had so much overlap, you know, from literally conception to our all of our years of living in this, like we shared a bedroom, we shared a childhood. I mean, this is like so much is similar, that there's just so much that doesn't need to be spoken, because it's just there foundationally. And what I think is very hard but necessary in relationships is to create that foundation with each other. But like, you are bringing together two entirely different childhoods with their own things, right? Like, you're bringing together two entirely different family cultures. I mean, you don't even have to, I mean, sometimes it's literally different cultures between people, right? These days, especially with like our very highly globalized world. But like, it's even if you're in the same hometown, like this kind of, small town or something, you could also just literally have very different family cultures, And so I think that sometimes, like, it's very interesting because we kind of know that we're different, like that, people are different, and there is something so beautiful and so wonderful about that. But when you just want to be understood, you're like, dang, like, wow, people are really, really, really different, like really different, like get their energy from completely different things, or, have completely different preferences for, just when they want to eat, or how, just all these particularities, which, you find in like a very close quotidian type of relationship. And I think that it kind of makes me think about how, like, it's hard because I think we always hear, like, communication is key, it's like you should communicate more, but like, I don't know if that does its service. Like, sometimes I wonder, like, what are we talking about when we talk about communicating more? Because if you've got if you have different definitions to things because of your backgrounds, right, then you are going to be talking so hard, and yet you're just going to be like butting, like you're going to be literally not communicating, even though you're trying to communicate really hard. It's almost like the harder you try, the worse it gets to communicate with each other. And so something that, like, Javier Rivera has his the Dating Theory YouTube channel, which is great. And he and I have talked a lot about, like, this idea of, like, you really kind of do make a new language. You have to make a new language with that person. You have to make a new language, and that's vulnerable because, I think about that in, like, learning Spanish or learning languages. It's so hard. It's like you're going to make so many mistakes, and you have to keep going, and it's tiring, so it's, but yet when you make that new language, it's like this very unique, like, one of one. There is no language that will be like that between you and the other person. But it does take work. It does take effort. It does take making mistakes and probably, misunderstandings along the way, which can feel very painful. But you have to kind of get yourself back up and say, like, no, we're going to keep working at trying to speak the same language, really. And that's not my language or your language, it's our language that we're really making kind of very in vivo, like very in live real time with the other person. So, and I think that having understandings of what is the common good, you kind of have at least an orientation for what that language is moving toward, I suppose, if you will. And I do think that, so it's funny because one of the things I think, like, I don't know, Daniel and I will ask each other some random question, like, just like, what's one of the things you'd say is like one of the most important things in a relationship? And, one of the things that we've definitely can, come to together in what we've talked about is, like, understanding, it's just to be understanding. And what I like about that in the context of what I'm saying with making a language is, like, because when you do speak the same language, you do understand. There's such, like, a relief, it's like, oh, you get what I'm saying. Like, you understand me, you see me. And I think that the understanding is also very tied to the freedom, because you extend that understanding to the person. You're not going to assume the worst about everything they do. You're not going to assume that if they're going to see, like, a friend for coffee, that they, like, hate you or something, that they don't want to be with you or something like that. So I just, those are some of the thoughts that came to mind. But I think the understanding goes a long way, because it just holds so much space for the person to be able to be, and be able to to be able to make mistakes, because that's life, you know, we will make mistakes. And I think we have to be able to be given that room to do that, and have the understanding, and to say like, hey, like I love you even if you have made this mistake, and I make my own mistakes, and kind of to be able to like kind of pull them up from their feet and really just say like, you know, to keep moving forward, and like to have that encouragement of you know, keep moving forward with this. I'll say one last thing that came to mind, just because it's something that I really think is fascinating too, with this whole topic of like, Thomas, you said something about like not being able to see the person actually in front of you. They're just like right there when it's like, I think this is, I wonder if this has gotten like just super, like a lot more difficult with the use of screens and the phone, because we are even more kind of displaced from the physicality of the person's actual presence there with us. So I don't know. I think that I'm interested in how that could make it even harder to see, or maybe it's just that it's an easier coping mechanism to be with one's like, you know, cellular device or whatever, their phone or the internet, even, we just want to expand this with the internet, versus to be with the person, or to be with your own self to deal with your traumas, right? To kind of have those still quiet moments where you have to face yourself. So anyways, those are just some thoughts that came to mind.
I think I agree that understanding is really important in a relationship. I think it's the fine line between, I mean, we focus so much on communication and what's being communicated, but when you truly understand, you realize that this person is constantly becoming someone who he or she still can't communicate about, because you're also discovering yourself, not just your journey with this other individual, but with yourself as their partner, as their wife, etc. And I think the analogy that you used, the example of you and your sister, the thing is, Michelle, you don't really get to pick your sibling. And with that comes the understanding that, okay, you know, whatever it is, I'm going to love it because it's my flesh and blood. And, you know, you try and empathize or relate more because you do have that thing in common. And it's something that's very unique. But with relationships, we can pick who we want to be with, you know, we all have a preference or a type, and I feel like you're spoiled for choice, and that choice sometimes hinders you from walking the extra mile, because, you know, the famous thing is there's many fish in the sea. So are you really understanding? You communicate once or twice, and if you feel like there's no middle ground, you're like, oh, you know what, it's not worth it, next. That being spoiled for choice, that the availability of choice also has an effect on how relationships are saved or begun, because nobody really walks the extra mile unless they're really persistent. It completely depends on the individual. Whereas when you're someone's sibling, or, you know, it's a parent, you make that effort because, you know, you share blood, or, you know, you're bonded, and that's sacred, right? But when you're trying to create something sacred, do you put the same effort? And that's where the difference is. Like, yes, sometimes being understood is so important, but you also have to understand that this person's not going to be at the same pace as you are, but are you willing to be that patient to communicate as you self-discover, and the other individual keeps up with you or tries to do that with you? Because you're not the same person as you begun. You know, you never are. We're constantly evolving and our perspectives change, and sometimes they change indirectly. And understanding means studying another person's patterns, their way of life, the way they speak, their interests, their likes, their dislikes, how their mood works. All of those things come into play. Whereas communication is always filtered. You're always trying to take it down a notch, or say it better, or be more polite. It's never as direct as your mood or your actions or the way you react to something, because that's a reflex. But when you're trying to have a conversation with another individual, you're always trying to consider a lot of things, and sometimes it gets lost in translation, because no matter what I say, you're only going to hear what you want to hear. And I truly believe in that statement, because you can never really be completely understood, as communication is different for every individual. And like you said, Michelle, the cultural differences come into play as well. I'm sure some things would sound absolutely Greek when you're culturally different, because you've not experienced that. And it takes a while for you to understand or to be involved and indulge in those cultures before you realize whether that's for you or if it isn't. Whereas when you communicate, you expect an instant response. I feel like with communication, you expect that instant gratification or validation, or, you know, the ability of being like, okay, you've got it now, right? It's out of the way. It's going to be right from the next moment. I feel like we have that unrealistic expectation, whereas with understanding, it involves a lot of patience. And that's one of the very important virtues to have in a relationship. Are we really patient enough to trust the process? And the process is very long. It really tends to be long if it's not going the way you want it to go, right? A lot of relationships don't go the whole mile is because you expect it to be a certain way. You fear what you don't understand, or you fear what you do not expect, because like you said, Thomas, you know, it's the perception or the illusion or your expectation of that individual. See, your expectation sort of decides the pace of how something evolves into something more. And I feel like in relationships, it's really important not to just understand the individual, but to understand your circumstances. Where you are at that point in your life also has an impact on how your journey begins or how far you go. And I think that's a really important factor. Understanding is so broad. It's so many different levels of understanding. It's about empathizing, it's about truly listening as well. Sometimes that's all an individual needs, to be heard, to be seen, and then to be understood, because that seems like the final product of your whole process. But are you really ever heard, truly heard? Do they really listen and see you? Those are some really important facts that I think affect modern day relationships. And like you said, Michelle, with phones and the internet and social media, we don't communicate normally. We really don't on social media. We constantly backspace or edit or repost, or, you know, you sort of create a perception. And sometimes it could be unapologetically you, that is who you truly are, and that shows and you live by it. But 9 times out of 10, you're, you know, keeping up with what you think is accepted, or you think, if I do this or if I post this, this person is likely to react to that. You know, it's you predicting. More than communicating, it's you predicting and trying to instigate a reaction, at least in modern times. Whereas it's supposed to be about you being authentic. I mean, can we really truly be authentic is another question, as we're constantly evolving. So I'm not going to go there, but I feel like authenticity and of you being more direct and unfiltered is so lost with technology and social media and the internet, because you can really mold everything from your screen time to the way you look on screen. It's not like when you meet someone and you can see them sweating on their way from the tube or the subway, you know, you actually, you know, put on a filter, you're fine, you're prim and proper. So the image is completely tweaked. So what are we trying to understand? So many things to understand, so many different levels of having to understand also complicates the journey.
That's great. I mean, that's what I love about these conversations. Sometimes when the wheel gets going, then the ideas are moving and it becomes overabundance of comments, of ideas. You know what's funny? The first thing came to my mind, 2 parts. Part one is, you know, the first thing in my mind was sincerity, right? In the sense that, I mean, yeah, the problem with communication is we think, and even as you said, like there's a difference between the explicit messaging of things and then the meta about the message, right? And that's the thing. It's that, you know, fundamentally, I think most relationship tensions are coming down to ultimately, the subtext of what's going on is, can you love me without judgment? Like, can you accept me for what I am and not for what I give you ultimately?
Yeah.
Like it's a kind of, like, actually it's funny, Sanduni, like Sanduni, your example about, like, you have 2 conversations and it's not going your way. You're like, oh, whatever, I'm done with this. Like that kind of flippantness. It's a great example because it's really powerful, because I think, because I had a note here about, you know, the force of natures versus the force of petty little humans of choice. You know, I think I don't know, one that motivated my movement from atheism into having a theistic point of view was just how radically pathetic human beings are in terms of how much like the things of force of natures will compel us just to do it. And yet we little petty little humans can't even like we can't squeak by a little effort to make a choice on our own volitions. It's just it's one of those examples, just in contrast of like that kind of generated, of course you love your family. Like of course Michelle loves her sister. Like it's kind of like that kind of like of courseness of it versus in when I actually wrote this in the essay, like, relationships are, for better or for worse, relationships had a lot of coercive force put on them for much of human civilization. It's only maybe post-World War II in the West, I would say, and, we can be arguing about where this is, that are kind of non-coercive modes, definitely non-legal, but even social coercions of relationships have been completely all removed. So now relationships are just ultimately expressions of freedom, right, of choice of individuals. And I don't know, call that when we stack that with then this like panic of people being abandoned, and we need to play these pretenses of, I need to get a reaction out of you, because ultimately, the expressions is vary based on, I'm going to use a genderist mode on this, but whatever. The mode of women being scared, having anxiety of their basically of sexuality, right, of sex being the exchange in relationship. Like I don't give you sex or my beauty, then I can't be in this relationship. So what happens if I lose my youth or I lose my beauty? Then there's the anxiety on that side. On men, we have the anxiety of success, right? So we have to basically, if I'm not successful, if I'm not achieving, can you love me still? But regardless of the particulars of that, it's the basic premise of ultimately subtext of conflict and because the thing is ultimately, I think especially like, for example, your siblings, you can have disagreements all the time. You could fight, you can argue, you can do all this craziness, but ultimately there's always this sub pretense of you were family. Like, I'm going to love you regardless. Like, this is sacrosanct and this will never be violated, right? Can we honestly say that about relationships? That's actually almost an indicator. Like, it's almost like the measure. No, and actually that's why it's actually rational people act the way they do, because it's all mercenary work. This is different. Like, this is just using a military metaphor. It's the same idea. Citizen soldiers have something at stake. They're not going to abandon the walls when the invasion comes. Versus mercenaries, if it's inconvenient or unadvantageous, they're out of there. I'm not putting my life on the line. I'm getting out of here. So I feel that tension in what we're talking about here. Because ultimately, yeah, I agree. It's this kind of the communication has, when you try to just overly make it explicit and not get both meta and subtext happen at the same time. It's kind of weird on both those dimensions. There's a real risk of insincerity, right? And this kind of, at best, relationship of utility, which it's fine, I guess, but I feel like it's definitely not hitting at the heart of what it means to be a person, to put it that way. Because ultimately, as we said, we want understanding, because it's true. Because I will say, my deepest friendships, like there's a kind of knowing that it's just like, you can literally give me a scenario of my best friends or friend who I know very close, intimately. That intimacy is a very key part about this. You can just say, what would my best friend Chris, what would Chris do under this circumstance? Like, oh, of course, obvious, he would do this, this, and this. This is how he would react. I could actually give you a full map schema of how he would react to a hypothetical and be completely confident that it would be right. And if I presented this to my best friend, he'd go, oh yeah, I would totally do that. Absolutely. That's so beyond explicit communication that's almost, I think human beings do that naturally, by the way, when we have intimacy. Like, it's similar to actually training in the arts, right? When we have to, when we're studying live figure drawings or things of nature or things like that, our attempt is to get intimate with it. We are trying to witness it and try to create a, basic effect, an image, right? A kind of imago that has a kind of, at best, an essence. Like, it's the best painting. Like, my favorite's actually seen like the paintings of Cézanne, for example, of southern France. And then you actually go there, and the colors and it is the same. It's like you get this hit. It's like, oh my God, that painting was right. That painting was like on the money of what was being said. It's a simulation. It's an image. It's not the actual thing. But that it's just when you see that kind of strike of of agreement between that painting and the actual landscaping. It's a beautiful thing. Anyways, that's just, I think kind of like, that's kind of what I'm meditating on hearing from this. Because also, by the way, the note about this, you know, language part is very powerful. I actually totally agree with that. I think, and Michelle, I don't know if you did it intentionally, but just you didn't use my language or their language, it's ours. It's a kind of, it's a commonness, right? And it has to be generated together. And that's the thing, and it probably happens organically. Because think about this, like not too intellectually. When you have really close friends, you have expressions. Like you have inside jokes, you have expressions, you have all these kind of textures of the relationship kind of embedded in your sayings and metaphors and expressions that might make absolutely no sense to anyone outside, but it makes perfect sense internally. So it's kind of like a private language in a way between the members. So yeah, those are my thoughts from this conversation, from this cycle of conversation.
So good. Yeah, no, definitely. They say that like identical twins in particular like have their own language. You know, it's kind of a phenomenon that you can read about, but it's definitely true. It's so much is like in this kind of little world of those that relationship that it would be like you're almost having to do translation for somebody looking outside into that. And I think that's just a lot of it is the process, right? And this kind of goes back to what you said, Sanduni. The process, like I think that was to me really struck me about this idea of like the continuing on to be able to still say what you maybe need to say or you feel is something you need to express. And even if it seems to like fall on deaf ears per se, you don't give up. You know, it's to not just be like, okay, well, I tried and it didn't work. So, you know, to be able to say like, no, I tried and I'm going to keep trying because this is who I am in a sense. And I mean, there could be risks with that because, you know, we can kind of just like hook onto our personality type and excuse any type of behavior we want to, right? But there are certain things that are like our essence, right? Or things that we just like feel or have, you know, or are working through or whatever, and you just are acknowledging it and saying, this is what I'm thinking, or this is what I'm feeling, or this is, you know, I feel a sense of whatever. And just to be able to still continue to be there as yourself, to show up and be who, you know, be that self, that vessel for what you are carrying, and allow that to be a process of allowing you both to make mistakes and even understanding each other, you know? So I just took that and I thought that was, you know, really important, like that, what you mentioned, Sanduni, about like the process. It's not quick. It's a long process. And the only reason why twins have like a you know, their own language, and why people like best friends and things like that have inside jokes and this things they can refer to, and they know they can just say one word and like suddenly they're like laughing, you know. It's just amazing. Like it's because they've had all these shared experiences and all these years of sharing life with each other, and you know, being able to just be be kind of just like, it's such a great space of being yourself. Just, it's like you can just be yourself. That's, I think, you just feel most comfortable. Like that's like, I think relationships that make you able to feel like at ease, you know, where you aren't like apologizing for yourself or explaining yourself away, you know, it's really important too. I mean, that has to do with the understanding.
The sense of comfort. I mean, yes, you're supposed to spend, I mean, you do naturally spend years together and grow up, share a household, and the bond is strong when you're siblings, because like I said, you don't really get to pick who you share blood with. You know, you're just born into the same family, and in your instance, you were born together. Even more profound. But the sense of comfort, like, we tend to be more selfish in relationships, whether we like to accept it or not, because we're trying to possess. Whereas when you're siblings, oh, she's already my sister, like that's not going to change no matter what I do to you. That is a fact, right? So you are already at that comfort of possession. And I think that's a very important element to consider, because a lot of relationships, are we trying to share the relationship, or are we trying to possess or own the other individual? It's a fine line, because love, as unselfish and selfless as it is supposed to be, it somehow turns into a selfish act of either projection or unwavering love. So the level of possession also plays a key role in how comfortable you are in a relationship, because you have to realize this individual is their own person. I chose to love them. I chose to feel whatever I do towards them, but that in no way makes them accountable to me or my property. You are not supposed to be owned or own them. You're supposed to share the bond, and that bond is supposed to be sacred, that it subconsciously becomes your very own. But when you fixate on possession, the level of comfort is lost, right? Because even when you're communicating, you're trying to make sure what you are saying is heard in the exactly same way you're saying it. Whereas, I mean, I'm going to stick to the sibling example. That level of comfort exists, like, yes, we're going to disagree, but we live in the same household, or we are siblings, we share the same DNA, she'll come around, he'll come around. But you have that fear of loss in a relationship you create. So the fear of loss and possession plays a key role in the way you act, especially with your level of insecurity. And we all have insecurities, some more than others, some more profound than the other. But insecurities, fear, and possession somehow become a huge part of intimate affairs, like intimate relationships. And that sense of, like we discussed, doing good and doing unwavering good, regardless of the outcome, having no expectations, that really doesn't happen, because at some point, even the expectation of wanting to be understood is an expectation, no matter how innocent or how sincere it is. You're still expecting to be accepted or understood or appreciated for your, undying affection. And when you don't receive that, you're disappointed. And that with that comes the fear of loss, the fear of change, the fear of being replaced. And that takes you on your own journey in your mind. Sometimes we create our own problems in the head before they even become a reality. And then somehow we force it into our reality. I mean, there have been so many times, Michelle, when you and I have talked and we've said, I think I'm reading too much into the situation. We tend to do that because we have this, sense of fear of loss. That's what it is, fear of being misunderstood, fear of not being able to repair whatever you think you did or the damage that could have happened, because you don't share DNA. Like, they're not going to come around. They could just go away or block, delete if it's virtual. That doesn't happen with siblings. It doesn't happen with families. Families fall out, but you're still family. Whereas relationships, you go from being lovers to strangers in a blink of an eye over a small disagreement, because you don't have your fear, your sense of fear is heightened compared to your sense of, empathizing or being patient. You're constantly scared of losing what? Losing yourself, or losing what you thought you could get out of this person, because sometimes it could happen very early in you getting to know a person. You've had a disagreement and you're like I said, this is not worth my time. I'm not going to read into it, or I'm not going to pursue it further. That's it. Why does that happen? That happens because you feel like you can't possess something soon enough. You can't influence this person soon enough. And that's it. There goes your option. And that chance is lost. And because you never took that chance, right? Whereas with siblings, you're like, okay, he's my elder brother, she's my sister, I'm going to flick up for him or her. With strangers, we don't do that. And, love is basically meeting someone and, them becoming your other half, but they are a stranger first. And that journey from being a stranger to a friend, to a partner, to a companion is a very slow process that requires patience. But I think we have more fear than patience in these relationships because of our insecurities, because of our past traumas, past relationships. You don't think anyone will go that far for you. I think that's one of the, personally, sometimes, you know, I tell my friends, yes, I'm a handful, but you've got to deal with it, because you don't try to possess your friends. You know they'll stick up for you. It's much like siblings. But when it comes to intimate affairs, you really have this mold where you really want to fit in, or you want the other person to fit into, where so much time and effort is lost in the fear of making it happen soon. And you have a timeline, right? Like, if you don't text me back in 2 days, I haven't done something right, or I haven't said the right thing. Why are we not as patient, right? Like, I mean, think about it. It's really the case. Everything has a timeline when it comes to intimate affairs. Whereas in families and friendships, you're like, oh, he'll come around. Yeah, I pissed him off. So what? You know, we're friends. We've been through it. I'm sure you and Chris do that all the time, Thomas. But with relationships, it's not like that. I have definitely upset this individual. He hasn't texted me soon enough, or she hasn't responded, or she gave a short response. That means, you know, it's cold feet. Maybe she's found someone else. We keep second guessing. There's so much fear in modern day relationships. And you see that around you when you communicate with even your friends. You're like, oh, maybe he's not going to like what I wear. About beauty, Thomas, you talked about that, about the female and the male contribution in a relationship, where one has to have success and one has to have beauty. And how much of it can you have? Is it good enough? It's always about, is it good enough for the other person, right? You could be really successful, but if I don't see your profession as something successful, then there you go. Your self-esteem just hits rock bottom because someone didn't validate it. Same goes for beauty, you know. Oranges and apples, you can't compare. What's beautiful to you cannot be beautiful to someone else, and that's totally fine. But do we accept that? No, we don't. When we like an individual, we are constantly fixating on the fact, why not me? Why am I not being seen? Why am I not enough? Those are the most common questions you tend to ask. So yes, I think fear, and the lack of patience and the need and the obsession to possess or own really hinders growth and whatever is possible that could happen, because, you know, you cut them short. You just either stop that process, or you don't like the process because it's not going at your pace or at your convenience.
It's funny because it's the idea that, right, I wrote my notes, the idea of, like, basically when we don't have sincerity, we don't have understanding, we don't have a sense of ease, it's all, what's the sign? Anxiety. And oh yeah, absolutely. The tempo of conversation is a very obvious signifier that not only is the frequency and the duration of the conversation, and was there a period at the end of the text versus no period. It's kind of ridiculous, the magnitude of when we talk about it this way. Like, it's almost like I'm sitting here going, well, yeah, because you have there's no principle at the foundation to hold this together. God help us. I don't know what the hell we're going to do on this point. I really don't, because I don't know, because I'm kind of like, what do we do? Because we can acknowledge that, I mean, I wrote in the essay, like, basically when you remove all external constraints and there's no common understanding and there's no common principle for foundating these relationships. And by the way, part of this is the problem of, especially in modern relationships, is the idea of, like, quite frankly, people just, I mean, I know when I was younger, I just had bad judgment, just literally bad judgment. Partly mixed by trauma, partly mixed by low self-esteem, like, pick your pick. Very unselfful, very empty cup when younger, very much so. So it's a mixture of things. Part of it's probably rational because, yeah, you don't have full judgment. And especially, you may think one, especially the big problem is you have an image in your head about what you think this person is. And then you actually takes the relationship to go through to present you now facts contrary to the image that was there. But again, it breeds the same original critique in the beginning, which is, oh, you actually weren't there with that person at all. You were interacting with a figure in your head this whole time. So that's on you, dude. But I will comment that, yeah, it is. I mean, we're not the first people to comment about this. Anxiety is just through and through the entire structure of relationships in the common day. I think the only ones that don't have this are people who have very absolute convictions on relationship. Like, there has to be, like, I've barely seen it. And, you know, by the way, I want to point out, like, this conversation about, like, oh, somehow, like, family is protected from, it's like the buffer. I've seen plenty of people who make comments, nope, doesn't matter, their family, dead, gone. Like, it has no grounds. Doesn't have that force of, it doesn't matter what you think. It doesn't matter what they did. They are still family regardless. That kind of security of a foundation is, that's very rapidly being challenged or bitten into. So I don't really know unless you're going to go the other way. I mean, that's partly why I love marriage so much. I think actually it matters a lot because it's not just, I mean, I really do believe it's something that is sacrosanct because it has the same properties. Not only does it generate families or can, we almost need it because if we don't have it, then what are we left with? We're left with basically anxiety. That's ultimately what we're left with. I can be challenged on this. I have no problems with that. One last note, I think this is actually very important. I think fundamentally, I think what we can ask of the people we're with is at least maybe not a full understanding of everything, because of course that's not going to happen. That's the kind of wish for oneness of the sameness. That's not going to work. I think at least we have to say, do they at least acknowledge what's important to me? Like, can they acknowledge what is important to me? I think that's a very fair point. I think almost if you cannot acknowledge, I just think about this as an example. Like, you may not be into baseball, but they're into baseball. Like, that's what I'm saying. Like, this is kind of like, you don't even have to have agreement. Like the same thing is important necessarily. And on every hobby and every particulars to still show intimacy and care for each other. As long as there's a super principle or something foundational that holds it together, I suppose. I'm just thinking through that. And this idea of possession, like we have this lack of security, lack of foundation, like literally, subsistence, like the thing that holds it together, holds it from the ground up, basically. And what's the reaction when you feel like you're on unshaky grounds? It's unsecure. You want to possess, grab, lock in. And the intellect is very good at that. I mean, that's actually like my biggest thread with my therapist in art therapy was at that point. I'm a very intellectual person. My mind goes like put it in a box, let's contain it, let's get all the dimensions of it. That's great, but that's an recipe for massive anxiety and just crushing of your heart, basically, at that point. Anyways, thank God on this one.
God help us. That's all I want to say. It's like underline.
You're fine, Michelle. You've taken a leap of faith and you're there. God help me and Thomas.
Yeah.
We're going in cycles, in circles here. Yeah.
Oh my goodness. I love this. I love that we got to talk about this because it's things that I'm sure we all think about these things quite a bit. And it's nice to be able to just talk them out here and really kind of, it's almost like does feel in a way therapeutic to just speak them out and really hash it out and work out some ideas here together, because it is so crucial, this topic. It's such a preoccupation of the mind, and so to be able to really grapple through it and just sort of get our bearings a little bit at least is really exciting for me. And I think it's important because I do think the anxiety point is just cannot be emphasized enough. I think there's so much fear, and it's like, I guess we're just so afraid of like that person rejecting us or never speaking to us again. We just like can't bear it. And it's like, well, why exactly is that? Is that because like we don't feel a sense of fulfillment in ourselves? We have to work towards the self-full, right? Of Thomas's essay, that word. Because if we can be content in ourselves, there's really no place. I mean, yes, it's going to come up again and again in one's heart and mind, but it's like you have an easier time kind of swatting it down and kind of keeping it and saying like, I don't need to like cave to that. I don't need to basically be subservient to my fear and my anxiety, because I know I'll be okay. Even if I am rejected just outright, like I will still have myself. And if I can believe enough in that, then I know that the right people who are meant to be in your life will be there. They will be there,
Yes, we keep saying that, sometimes you've just got to accept that everyone isn't for you and just move on and be okay with that. And that's probably the right thing, but the right thing and the hardest thing are the same. Like when our expectation or the illusion is just dismantled, that bruises our ego and pride. And that's another topic that we should really touch upon when discussing relationships and trauma, because there's a lot of ego and self-centeredness and pride. There's pride in how you pursue someone. There's ego in how the response to that pursuing is given. Like, how is someone responding to the way you chase them or pursue them? And then a lot of that comes into play when you decide what happens in a relationship, because it's very self-centered and there's so much pride. You know, you never want to text first, you never want to call first, or you don't want to double text. These are modern day problems, and they really play a key role. I mean, a modern day story just ends, you know, nobody just texted first. Nobody picks up the phone and thinks, you know, I'm going to do this. I'm going to be brave enough to say how I feel, because we really don't tell anyone how we feel. We just tell them how to feel about us. We never tell them how we feel. It's more like, you're not giving me attention, you're not into me, but hang on a minute, maybe that's how you see it. Maybe I am giving you attention, but it's not the kind of attention you want. It's want versus need, pride versus ego. I think those are some elements as well that we can discuss about how relationships are perceived and how it decides and sets the tone for the journey, especially in modern dating. I'm talking about modern dating because when I look at my parents, I don't see any sort of ego or pride involved there. And, you know, they've been happily married for 30 years and counting. And then I look at myself in the mirror and I'm like, I'm going through the same cycle. It's just the same circle of meeting different individuals who more or less have the same response. And sometimes you seem to be aware of it. And as much as you want to acknowledge it, you tend to think, well, it's not my place to highlight that you've got an issue in the way you pursue an individual, and you just let it go.
But you know what's funny? Because I think, you know, it's funny because most people generally think philosophy, what's the point of this? This is a bunch of nonsense. It's a bunch of pie in the sky thinking. You know, I think actually at the core, having a better understanding of relationships and how we could have better, more, because you know what I'm thinking of Plato. I'm thinking of the poet, the line in Crito, where basically, just a quick summary note, basically Plato was given the option to escape and not be killed by hemlock. And the ship's there, he can go. He says, no, I can't go. He was a hypothetical, like the law is actually talking to him, like it's personifying talking to him. And he says, Socrates, what is this of you? You're the one who said integrity and goodness and laws and institutions are the most precious things human beings have. And you'd be willing to destroy them all for the sake of you surviving. What would that actually mean to you? And basically, the character Socrates says back, I couldn't do that. I'd be destroying myself if I did that. And at least philosophy can at least point us in the direction of maybe what's the gap, maybe what is lacking, right? Because every lack points to some sign of what, maybe not it doesn't give us the definitive answer, but a lack of these points gives us the beginning. It starts the journey of conversation, at least. So I think we came to actually a relatively good point about this tension of anxiety. It's almost a sign of it. And it's pointing to something's going on here. Maybe we don't have a definitive answer yet what to do about it, but at least we can acknowledge it. And that's a nice fertile ground to start, maybe another round conversation. So I want to thank you both for your time for this conversation. It's really rewarding.
It's been great. It's been super rewarding. Thank you. I honestly, like, I hate going because I love talking to you both so much, and it's been very fruitful for me. But hopefully we could do this again sometime. Maybe we can focus on some of the things that are lingering here. And I really appreciate it again. Seriously, so wonderful to talk about it. I've got all my notes down so I can jot out something for myself as a little either a poem or something that I can use to just kind of keep this as a marker for our conversation.